In this tutorial, I'm gonna show you guys how to install Python, right? And I'm just gonna double click. Basically, just in this Python. So now I'm just gonna come down here and click Create our on world. So this is like a very basic Python program. And what this is going to do is it's just going to print out hello world onto the screen. And so now what I can do is I can actually run this file, and we're actually getting a little error here. It wants us to create a new line at the end of the file. And so now in order to run our Python program, I'm just going to come up here to the top, and I'm just going to click run, and we'll click this run button right here. And now we'll see what happens. So it's asking me what I want to run. I can just click app. And down here at the bottom, you'll notice that we have this text that just got printed out, hello world. And so whatever I print or whatever I put inside of this print statement is going to get printed out down below in the console. So as long as you're getting that print statement to work, then you've actually written your first Python program. And as we go forward in the course, we're going to be writing all sorts of awesome Python programs, and we're going to be doing all sorts of cool stuff. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about writing a basic Python program. So we're going to write just a very simple Python program. We're going to look at how we can go ahead and write our programs. We're going to talk about how our programs are getting executed by Python. And we're also going to draw out a little shape onto the screen. So this is going to be pretty cool. I'm excited to talk to you guys about just the bare basics of Python and really just sort of give you an introduction. So over here, we have our basic text editor. And so any of the Python code that I write inside of this file is actually going to get executed by Python. So this Python file has a bunch of Python code inside of it. And basically what we're doing when we're programming in Python is we're just giving the computer a set of instructions, right? That's really what programming is. It's just like we're specifying a set of instructions, and the computer is going to go off and execute those instructions that we give it. And so the more complex the instructions we give to the computer, the more complex the tasks the computer can carry out. So I want to show you guys how we can use some Python instructions or some Python code in order to draw out a shape onto the screen. So I'm actually going to draw out a little triangle. So over here, we can actually print something out onto the screen in Python using something called a print statement. So I can just type out print, and inside of these parentheses, I can just type some quotation marks, and inside the quotation marks we can put whatever we want to print out onto the screen. So I'm gonna copy this, and I'm actually gonna make a few of these little print statements, and we're gonna actually draw a shape. So we're gonna draw like a triangle type shape. So down here I'm just gonna draw a forward slash, and then up here I'll make a space, and we'll do another forward slash. Here we'll make 2 spaces, we'll do another forward slash, and over here we're gonna make 3 spaces and a forward slash. And now I'm going to draw like vertical bars going all the way down. And actually we can do some underscores here as well. That'd be kind of cool. All right, so now we have our triangle looking shape, and you can see it looks kind of like a right triangle. So I can save my file, and I can either come up here to run and click run app, or if you're using PyCharm, you can also just come over here and click this play button. And when I click the play button, I want you to notice what happens down here. So down here we have this little window, and this is called the console. And basically the console is just a place where Python is going to output some information. So when we use this print statement, we're basically telling Python on like, hey, can you print something out onto the console? So there's a lot of situations where we're going to want to see what's going on in our code. And we can use that print statement and print things out to the console. And we can basically like have a little window into what our program's doing. In our case, we're just going to be printing out this triangle onto the console. So I'm going to come over here and click this play button. And you'll see down here, we're actually printing out that triangle. So mission accomplished, we were able to print out our shape. So I could really draw any shape I wanted as long as I was able to specify it inside of these print statements. And so essentially what Python's doing when I click that play button is it's going into this file and it's looking at all of these instructions in order. So the first thing it does is it goes to this instruction and it says, okay, they want me to draw out these like little forward slash and this vertical bar onto the screen. Once it does that, it goes down to this instruction. It says, okay, they want me to print something out again. When it prints that out, it goes down to this instruction, etc. So Python is actually going to execute the lines of code that we write in order. So the order in which I write the instructions matters a lot. So for example, if I was to take this last line here and put it up here at the top, now when I save the file, instead of just drawing out that triangle, it's going to draw out this little upside down bottom thing at the top and then the rest of the triangle down here. So the order of the instructions actually matters a lot. So this is basically how your Python programs are going to go. As we go through this course, we're going to learn more and more of these little lines. So here we're just using this little print function. Basically, it just prints something out onto the screen. There's a bunch of little things like this that we can learn. And as we go through, we'll learn more and more instructions that we can give to the computer. But in this lesson, I just want to kind of show you guys the basics, right? We can essentially just define these little instructions for the computer, and the computer will execute them in order. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about using variables in Python. Now, in Python, you're going to be dealing with a lot of data. And so a lot of times in our program, we're going to be working with all types of information and data and values. And sometimes that data can be difficult to manage. So in Python, we have this thing called a variable. And it's basically just a container where we can store certain data values. And when we use a variable, when we put those data values inside containers, it makes it a lot easier for us to work with and manage all of the different data inside of our programs. So variables are extremely helpful, and it's sort of like a core topic in Python that you're really going to want to know and master. So in this tutorial, I'm going to teach you guys everything you need to know to get started with variables. We're going to look at what they are, why they're useful, and we'll look at the different types of variables and the different types of data that we can store inside of variables. So over here in my Python file, I just have a very simple program, and it's basically just printing some text out onto the screen. And so this is actually a little story that I wrote. It says, there once was a man named George. He was 70 years old. He really liked the name George, but didn't like being 70. And so this is a valid Python program. I could go ahead and run this program, and you'll see down here in the console, everything prints out, and it looks great. So we have an awesome little Python program here. But let's say that inside of our story, I wanted to change the character's name. So instead of naming the character George, let's say I wanted to name the character John. Well, I'm going to have to go through and I'm going to have to manually change the name George to the name John at every place inside of this story where it's mentioned. So I'm going to have to go over here and I'll say, okay, John, I'm going to have to manually change that. And then, okay, down here, we're going to have to, again, manually type in John and change it to John. So in order to change the character's name, I had to manually go in and change it in both places. And now let's say, okay, maybe we want to change the character's age also. So in addition to changing the name, we also want to change the age. Let's make him a little bit younger. So why don't we say John is going to be 35. And so you'll see here, I had to come here and manually change the age and then come down here and manually change it again, right? And now that we changed it, like it's going to work, it's going to be updated in our program. But you'll notice that in order to make that change, like I had to look through the entire program, find where that value was and change it. And this was only with 4 lines of the story. Imagine if I had a story that was like thousands of lines long and we mentioned the character's name and age like hundreds of times. I mean, I'd have to look through each one of those lines and manually change the character's name. And that is not a very good way for us to do this. And it's really not a good way for us to manage the data in our program, right? The character's name and the age. And so we can actually use a variable in order to store the character's name and the character's age. And when we use that variable, it'll make it a lot easier for us to put the character's name and age inside of our little program here. So I'm going to show you guys how we can create a variable for the character's name and age. And I'm just going to go up here above this print statement. And up here, I want to create a variable. So when we create a variable in Python, we actually need to give Python a couple pieces of information. The first piece of information we need to give Python is the name of the variable. So I need to actually assign a name to this container where we're going to be storing information. And so all I have to do is just type out the name of the variable that I want to create. So I'm going to create a variable called character name. So I'm just going to say character, and I'm going to say underscore name. And so generally when you're creating a name for a variable in Python, you want to separate different words with an underscore. So I have 2 words here and I'm separating them with an underscore. And now what I need to do is I need to put a value inside of this variable. So basically what I can do is I can just say equals, and over here I can type a value. So I'm just going to type out the character's name inside of quotation marks. So we're just going to type out John. So now we have a variable for the character's name. And below this character name variable, I want to create another variable called character age. So I'm just going to type out character underscore age, and I'm going to set this equal to the character's age, which is 35. So we now have 2 variables, one representing the character's name and one representing the character's age. So what I can do now is I can replace the character's name inside of the story with this variable. And I'm going to show you guys how to do that. So if we want to put a variable inside of this print statement, I'm actually going to have to do a couple things. The first thing I'm I'm going to have to do is end off this text in here. So I'm going to have to put a quotation marks here at the end. And you can see I'm basically end off this text in here. So I'm going to have to put a quotation marks here at the end. And you can see I'm basically wrapping this whole thing into a single like quoted line. And now I also have this text over here at the end. So I'm going to have to put a quotation mark here. And so now I have a bunch of text here in quotation marks. And then I also have text over here in quotation marks. Now inside of here, instead of saying the character's name, I want to refer to that character name variable. So I'm just going to say plus character underscore name, and I want to say another plus sign. So I basically am saying I want to print out all of this text plus the value that's stored inside of character name plus all of this text. And what this will do is it'll actually print out the character's name when we print this. So I'm going to go ahead and run this program. And you'll see down here, and actually let me put a space over here, and we'll run it again. So you can see down here, we still are printing out there once was a man named John. And so what Python is doing is when it executes this line of code, it's coming over here and it's seeing, oh, okay, they want to print out the value inside of character name. So Python's going to go up here, it's going to get the value, and it's going to insert it inside of there. So I can basically do this for every instance of the character name in my file. So I can, I'll just copy this guy right here, and I can just paste it down here where the character's name is. So I'll paste this, and you can see now we're doing exactly the same thing that we did up there. I can also do this for the character's age. So I'm going to come down here, and I'll paste in what we just pasted in. And I'm going to change this. Instead of character name, we'll change it to character age. And I'm going to do this in one more spot. So we're going to do this over here where we're mentioning the age. And again, I'll just change this to character age. And so now when I run this program, it's going to print out the same story that we were printing out before. But now I don't actually have to type in the character's name and the character's age. I can just refer to this variable. And the cool thing about variables is if I wanted to change the character's name, now all I have to do is change it up here. So I could change the character's name to like Tom or something. And we could also change their age. So I could change the age to be like 50. And now that's going to automatically update throughout our entire story. So when I click this play button, you'll see now we're using the name Tom and he's 50 years old. So that's where variables can come in handy. And this can be a really awesome way to control and manage the data that's inside of our programs. With variables, you can also modify their values. So for example, let's say that halfway through the story, I wanted to change the character's name. Well, I can just make some new lines over here. And down here, I can actually assign a new value to one of these variables. So I could say like character underscore name. And in order to give it a different value, all I have to do is just say equals and we'll give it a different value. So let's say halfway through the story, we want to change the character's name to Mike. Well, now when I run my program, you'll see here in the first part of the story, it says there once was a man named Tom. And in the second part of the story, it's referring to the name as Mike. So I actually updated the variable inside of my program over here. And that's a really awesome way. You know, a lot of times in these programs, you're going to want to be modifying the values of variables. So you can do it just like that. And so finally, I want to talk to you guys about the different types of data that we can store inside of these variables. So over here, I have the character name and the character age. And I'm actually storing what are called strings. So a string is basically just plain text, right? So the name Tom, that's just plain text. Down here, these guys are strings as well. So there's a data type in Python called a string, and it's just basically going to store plain text. So, you know, any text that you would have like in a story or, you know, someone's name, you can store inside of a string. There's also another type of data that we can store inside of Python, which is numbers. So in addition to storing text, we can also store numbers. So if I wanted to store a number, for example, let's say we wanted to store the character age instead of inside of a string, we could store it inside of a number. So I could just type out 50. And when we're storing a number, we don't need these quotation marks. You only need that quotation mark when you're storing a string. So if I wanted to store a number, I can just write it out like this. And in addition to using whole numbers, I could also use decimal numbers. So I could say like 50.5678213. And Python's going to be able to store that number as well. You can store all different types of numbers. And we can also store what's called a Boolean value. And a Boolean value is essentially a true or a false value. And there's a lot of instances in programming where we're going to want to represent true or false data. For example, I could have a variable called like is male. And this would tell me whether or not someone was a male. And in my case, it would be true because I'm a guy, right? So I can, actually this needs to be capital. So I could store a value of either true or false. And actually, if we were naming this in Python, we'd want to use an underscore. So I would say is underscore male, and this can be either true or false. So true or false values is maybe not something that you're used to dealing with like in the real world, but in programming, we're going to be using true or false values all the time. They're super important. So like I said, there's three basic types of data that we can work with in Python. There's strings, which is just like plain text, numbers, which would be like either decimal numbers or whole numbers like this, and there's true or false values. And these are the basic types of data. I mean, there's a bunch of other types of data that we can use, but I would say 99% of the time as a new user and a new programmer to Python, you're just going to be dealing with these three types of data. So those are the basics of the data, and also with variables, and you're going to be using variables all the time in Python, so you definitely want to practice up and get comfortable using them. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about working with strings in Python. Now, one of the most common types of data that we're going to be working with in Python is going to be strings. And strings are basically just plain text. So any text that we want to have inside of our program, we can store inside of a string. So I want to talk to you guys about all the cool things we can do with strings, and we're basically just going to get a full introduction into why strings are awesome. So over here, I'm just going to actually print out a string. So I'm just going to say print, and inside of these parentheses, I can type out a string. In order to create a string, I need to use quotation marks. So I can make an open and close quotation marks, just like that. Now, inside of the quotation mark, I can put whatever text I want the string to have. So we could say like Draft Academy. And so now we have a string with the text Draft Academy inside of it. So if I run my program, now down here, we're going to print out Draft Academy, as you can see. And when we have these strings, there's actually a bunch of cool things that we can do with them. So one thing I could do would be to create a new line inside of the string. So if I wanted, I can come over here and I can say \n, and you can see it got highlighted in a different color. And what this is going to do is it's actually going to insert a new line into the string. So now it's going to say Draft on one line and Academy on another line. So I'm going to click play, and you'll see down here we just get Draft Academy. In addition to the \n, I could also use a \quotation mark. So if I wanted to put a quotation mark inside of my string, I can't just put a quotation mark like that, because Python's going to think that I'm trying to end this string. So if I want to include a quotation mark, I can just use this special \/ character, and that's called the escape character, and it basically just tells Python that whatever character comes after it, we want to render literally. So when I say backslash quotation mark, it basically means like, hey Python, I want to print out a quotation mark. And so now we'll be able to print out a quotation mark right there. I can also use this to print out a backslash. So if I need to print out a backslash, I could say backslash and it'll just print out a normal backslash now. So you can see it just like that. So if you want, you can use that backslash to make new lines or print out quotation marks, or you can just use it as a normal backslash. In addition to just typing out a string here, I could also create a string variable. So I could come down up here and we can create a variable and we'll just call it phrase. And I'm going to set it equal to Giraffe Academy. So I can store this string value inside of a variable called phrase. And then when I want to print out that variable, or I want to access that string variable, I can just type the name of the variable. And you'll see that it's going to print out the value that was stored inside of it. I can also use something called concatenation. And concatenation is basically the process of taking a string and appending another string onto it. So I could come over here and I could say phrase, and I could say plus, and now I can add in another string. So I could say like, is cool. And now this is going to say Giraffe Academy is cool. So I'm basically appending another string onto another one. They call that concatenation. And so in addition to doing all that stuff, we can also use special things called functions. And a function is basically just a little block of code that we can run, and it'll perform a specific operation for us. And so we can use functions to modify our strings, and we can also use functions to get information about our strings. So I'm going to show you guys a couple of common functions we can use with these strings, and they're actually going to do awesome stuff. So in order to access one of these functions, I can just say phrase, and then I can say dot. And I'm going to show you guys a function that we can use to convert this string entirely into lowercase. So I could just say phrase.lower, and then I'm going to want to type in open and close parentheses. And this will take this phrase, it'll take my string, and it'll convert it to lowercase. So you can see now we just have Giraffe Academy down here, but it's entirely in lowercase. I could also do the same thing for uppercase. So I could say phrase.upper, and this will convert the entire string into uppercase. You can see now it's entirely uppercase. So in addition to converting the string into uppercase and lowercase, I could also check to see if a string is entirely uppercase or entirely lowercase. So for example, I could say phrase.isUpper, and this is going to give me back a true or a false value. So it's going to be true if the string is entirely uppercase, or false if it's not. And you can see here we're getting a false value because this isn't uppercase. I can also use these functions in combination with each other. So for example, I could say phrase.upper and then a parentheses, and then after this I could say .isUpper. And now what it's going to do is it's going to run this upper function, it's going to convert it into uppercase, and then it's going to run this isUpper function right after that. And you'll see now we're going to get a true value back because it will have converted the whole thing into uppercase. So you can see now we're getting a true value. So you can use these functions one after another. It can be really useful. And there's a few other ones that I want to show you. So we can also figure out out the length of this string. So if I wanted to figure out how many characters were inside of this string, I could just say len, and I'm actually going to make an open parentheses, and I'm going to make a close parentheses. So I'm essentially saying len, and this is another function, it's the length function. And inside of this len function, I'm actually passing this phrase variable. I'm basically giving the length function this, and it's going to spit out a number. So it'll tell me how many characters are inside of this string. And so you can see here we get 15 because there's 15 characters inside of Draft Academy. So that's how we can get the length of a string, and that's going to be characters. Inside of Draft Academy. So that's how we can get the length of a string, and that's going to be really useful as we go forward in Python. We can also get individual characters inside of a string. So imagine if I wanted to just grab one of these characters. Like imagine if I wanted to figure out what the first character in this string is. Well, I can actually use an open and closed square bracket just like that, and in here I can specify the index of the character that I want to grab. So if I wanted to grab the first character in this string, I can put in a 0. So if I say phrase square bracket 0, this is going to give me that capital G. And you can see down here, that's what gets printed out. Now I want to point something out. In Python, when we're working with strings, a string gets indexed starting with 0. So you'll notice that in order to access this G, I had to put a 0 in here. And that's because in Python, when we use indexes on a string, we start with 0. So if Python is counting the characters or it's indexing the characters in a string, it's going to start with 0. So it's going to say G is 0, I is 1, R is 2, A is 3. So we would say that G is or it's indexing the characters in a string, it's going to start with 0. So it's going to say G is 0, I is 1, R is 2, A is 3. So we would say that G is at position 0 in the string, I is at position 1, R is at position 2, A is at position 3, etc. So we start counting at 0. So if I wanted to access the first character in the string, this G, I have to say phrase 0. And that's just a special thing in Python, and actually most programming languages do that, so they'll start with 0. So for example, if I wanted to access this A, I'm going to have to put 0, 1, 2, 3. So if I put 3 inside of here, now we'll be able to access that first A. As you can see, we get an A right here. So this This is actually really useful, being able to grab a specific character inside of a string, and you're going to be using that a lot as we go forward in Python. There's also another really awesome function that we can use, and it's called the index function. And basically what the index function will do is it'll tell us where a specific character or string is located inside of our string. So I could say phrase.index, and I can actually give this a value. So sometimes when we use these functions in Python, we can actually give them information. So I can give this a value. And we would call this passing a parameter. So I would call a value that I would give to a function a parameter, and you'll hear that word a lot. So for example, I could say inside of here, capital G, and now this is gonna return the index of the capital G inside of our string. So it should give us back a 0 because G is at the 0th index. And you'll see down here that we get a 0 because that's where G is. So for example, if I put an A inside of here, like a lowercase, case A, it should give me 0, 1, 2, 3, because that's where the first A is inside of this string. So I can click the play button, and you'll see it's giving us a 3. You can also put actual words in here. So for example, I could put like academy in here, or I could even just put like ACAD, and this is gonna tell me where this starts inside of my string. So when I click play, it's gonna give me an 8 because that's where academy starts, right? 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. If I put something in here that wasn't in the string, so for example, if I put a Z in here, that's not in here, it's actually gonna throw an error. So when I play this, you'll see that we get this error down here because Z is not found inside of our program. So that index function, again, can be really useful, and we'll be using that a lot. There's also one more that I wanna show you, which is called replace. So we can say phrase.replace, and in here, I can actually give this 2 parameters. So I can give this replace function 2 values that it can use. And the first thing I want to give it is what I want to replace. So for example, I could say giraffe, and then I'm gonna put a comma in here, and I wanna put in here what I wanna replace giraffe with. So I could just say like elephant, and now instead of saying Giraffe Academy, this is gonna print out Elephant Academy. So you can see down here, it just says Elephant Academy. So this replace function can be really awesome because we can replace certain words or even certain letters inside of our strings with other ones. So those are just some basic ways that we can work with strings inside of Python. And there's a lot of these different functions that we can use with strings. These are some of the most common, the ones that I just showed you right now. But if you just do a Google search, you can find all sorts of Python functions that you can try out and use and see what they do. But you definitely want to get comfortable working with strings in Python because you're going to be working with them a lot. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you about working with numbers in Python. Now, numbers are one of the most common data types in Python, and any Python program you write is most likely going to be dealing with numbers at some point. So I want to talk to you guys about just the basics of using numbers. We're going to talk about the different types of numbers that we can represent in Python. And I also want to show you guys some awesome functions that we can use with numbers. So we can do certain like mathematical operations. We can do some awesome things with numbers. And I'm going to show you guys all of that in this video. It's going to be awesome. So first thing we can do is we can actually just like print out a number. So if I want to write a number in Python, it's really easy. I basically just write the number. So I could say like print 2, and this is just going to print the number 2 out onto the screen. So I can use a whole number like this. I could also use a decimal number. So I could say like 2.0987, and Python Python's going to be just fine with that. We'll be able to print that out onto the screen as well. I can also make numbers negative. So I could make this 2.0987 a negative number, and Python will be able to handle that just fine too. In Python, we can also use basic arithmetic. So I could do things like addition, subtraction, multiplication. So I could say like 3 plus 4. And now this is going to print this out. Or why don't we say like 3 plus 4.5. And this will be able to print out the answer, so we get 7.5. And we can do addition, we could do subtraction, we could do division, or we could do like multiplication as well. So you can pretty much do whatever you want inside of Python. And if you want to make more complex mathematical equations, we can also use things to specify order of operations. So I could use parentheses. So for example, if I said 3 times 4 plus 5, what Python's going to do is it's going to multiply 3 and 4 together. So it's going to be 12, and then we'll add 5 to that. So we should get 17. But let's say that we wanted to change up the order, right? I could actually put a parentheses around 4 and 5. And now it's going to add them first. So it'll add 4 and 5. So we'll get 9, and we'll multiply that times 3. So we should end up with 27. So you can see we can use those parentheses to specify order of operations. So I could make like a very complex little equation here just by using numbers and parentheses. We can also use one other operation, which is called the modulus operator. So I could say like 10 and use this percent sign 3. And this is actually read 10 mod 3. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to take the first number, divide it by the second number, and it's going to spit out the remainder. So it's basically going to say, okay, 10 divided by 3, that's going to be 3 with a remainder of 1. So this is going to give us the remainder, and you'll see down here we get 1 because that's the remainder of 10 divided by 3. And that modulus operator can come in handy quite a bit. We can also store these numbers inside of variables. So we can store them inside of these variable containers. So I could come over here and I could create a variable called like my underscore num, and we'll just store a value of, let's say like 5 in here. And so I could come down here and I can just print out my underscore num, and we'll be able to print that number out to the screen just fine. So in addition to doing things like a basic arithmetic, we can also do some other stuff. So one thing I could do is I could actually convert this number into a string. So if I wanted to convert this number into a string, I can just say str, and I can put the number that I want to convert inside of these parentheses. And so what's going to happen now is this number is going to be converted into a string. So when I click the run button, you'll see it's just printing out 5, but now instead of being a number, this is actually a string. And this is going to come in handy when you want to print out numbers alongside strings. So I can come over here and I can say like my favorite number, and we'll be able to print this number along with this string. So I can click play, and it says 5, my favorite number. If I was to get rid of this string right here and I wasn't converting the number into a string, Now Python's going to have a problem with this. It's not going to allow us to do that. You can see we get an error. So anytime you want to print out a number next to a string, you got to make sure that you use that little string function. So there's a bunch of other stuff that we can do with numbers, and a lot of times in Python you're going to want to be using specific like more advanced math operators. So there's a bunch of different math functions that we can use on our numbers. And a function is basically just like a little collection of code that does something. So a function could perform an operation like a mathematical operation on our number. It could also give us information about our number. So I'm going to show you guys some of the most common functions that you'll be using in Python related to numbers. The first one is called ABS, and it stands for absolute value. So we can get the absolute value of a number. And so over here, I'm just going to make this variable -5. And basically, I can just say ABS, and I can make an open and close parentheses over here. And this is going to give me the absolute value of this number up here. So when I click the play button, you'll see it's just giving us 5, because 5 is the absolute value of -5. I can use a few other functions. There's another one which is called POW. It's just POW. And I'm actually not going to use this variable. We just use a normal number. And this function is going to allow us to pass it 2 pieces of information. So I can give this function 2 pieces of information. The first is going to be like a number, and the second is going to be the power that I want to take that number to. So I could say like 3, 2, and this is basically just going to be 3 raised to the power of 2. So it's just going to be 3 squared, so we should get 9 down here. You can see that we do. So I could pass in like, some crazy number, like we could pass in a 4 and we could raise it to the power of 6. And so we should get like a pretty big number here. And you can see we get 4,096. So this POW function is really useful for taking numbers to specific powers. So in addition to using this POW function, we can also use another function which is called max. So I can say max, and what this is going to do is it's basically going to return the larger of the 2 numbers that we pass into it. So right now I'm giving this a 4 and a 6, and this should tell us which number is higher. So over here it's just printing out 6 because that's the bigger number. I can also use another function called min, and this is going to do the opposite. So now instead of printing out the max number, it's going to print out the smallest number, and it's going to print out 4 down here, as you can see. Another cool function is called the round function, and this is going to allow us to round a number. So it's just going to follow like standard rounding rules. So if I said like 3.2 inside of here, now it's going to round it down to just normal 3. But if I said like 3.7, it's going to round it up to 4. So that'll allow you to round a number. So there's a few other functions that I want to show you guys, but in order to get access to them, I'm actually going to have to do something called importing. And in Python, we can actually import external code into our files. And so if I want to access these specific math functions, I have to import something called Python math. So I can just say from up here, math, import, and this star. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to go out and it's going to grab a bunch of different math functions that we can use. So I already showed you guys a few of these different math functions, but there's actually a bunch more. And in order to access them, we're going to need to include this line of code inside of our file. So once we have that, now I can access access a few others. So there's another function which is called the floor method, and it's just floor. And what this will do is it'll basically just grab the lowest number. So it's essentially just going to chop off this decimal point. And you can see over here now we get a 3 because we're using that floor function. There's also another one called ceil, and that's just going to do the exact opposite. So that's just going to round the number up no matter what. So no matter what, we'll always get 4 if we have a 3 point whatever here. And there's another one which is called square root. So it's just sqrt. And essentially this is just going to return the square root of a number. So I could say like 36, and now we should get 6 back. So those are all some very interesting functions. And inside of this math module, so we would call this a module, and you don't have to worry too much about what that is right now. Just know that when we put this line of code into our program, it gives us access to a lot more math functions. So it basically allows us to do a lot more things with math inside of our program. And there's a bunch of different math functions in Python. And if you want, you can basically just go online and search for different math functions. I showed you guys a few here, and I would say the ones that we looked at here are probably the most commonly used, but there's a bunch more. And like I said, there's tons of documentation on all of this stuff. So you can just look up, math functions in Python, and there's going to be tons and tons, like lists of these things that you can use inside of your programs to perform different math operations. But for now, that's just been a little bit about using numbers, a little bit about doing, certain math operations and using functions with those numbers. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to get input from a user. So we're basically going to allow a user to input information into our program. And I'm actually going to take the information that the user inputs, I'm going to store it inside of a variable, and then we're going to be able to do something with that variable. So I want to show you guys how we can actually go about getting input from someone. And down here in my Python file, all I have to do to get input from someone is I just have to type out input and then an open and closed parentheses. And what this is basically going to do is it's going to tell Python like, hey, we want to get input from a user, and Python will allow the user to type in some information. And inside of these parentheses, we can actually type a prompt. And so generally when we want the user to enter in some information, we want to tell them what we want them to enter. And that's what we can put inside of here. So I'm just going to say, enter your name. So we're actually going to create a little Python app which is going to allow the user to enter in their name, and then we'll store the name inside of a variable, and then we'll basically just say hi to the user. So we'll say like hi, and then whatever the name they entered was. So what I want to do is I actually want to store whatever the user inputted into our program inside of a variable. So I can actually go over here and I can create a variable. I could just call it name, and I could set this variable equal to input. So what I'm doing now is I'm taking the value that the user inputs and I'm storing it inside of this variable container called name. And so now I have access to whatever they entered in. So what we can do is we can say print, and inside of the parentheses I can just print out hello, and then I'm just going to add on to this name. And actually, why don't we put an exclamation point? So essentially we're getting a name from the user, we're storing it inside of the name variable, and I'm printing it out onto the screen. So I'm going to go ahead and play this, and when we run the program, you'll notice down here Python is giving us this little prompt. So it's saying enter your name. And now in here I can actually type in a value. So I could type in Mike, and then I can just hit enter, and Python's going to go ahead, store this value inside of that variable, and then it's going to print out hello Mike. And so this is kind of cool, and actually what we could do is we could prompt the user to enter in more than one piece of information. So I could actually copy this line of code, and I'm going to paste it below here, and why don't we have the user enter in another variable. So we could have them enter in, for example, their age. And over here we just want to say enter your age. And so now we're able to get two pieces of information from the user, and I could say hello name, and then I can say you are, and I'll print out their age. So I'm just going to print age. So now I'm basically able to get both of these pieces of information from the user. I can get their name and I can get their age. So when we run this program, I can type in both of those pieces of information. So it'll say enter your name. So we could just make up a name like John and then enter the age. Let's say John is 25. And now it's going to say, hello, John, you are 25. So the program is able to get input from the user, and then it's able to use that information in order to say hi to the user and tell them how old they are. And so getting input from the user is a great way to make your programs more interactive. And here we're just scratching the surface, right? We're just basically getting two, pieces of information from the user, but you can use these inputs to do awesome things in Python. And as we go through this course, you're going to see some really cool things that we can do with these inputs. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to build a very basic calculator in Python. We're basically going to build a calculator where we'll get two numbers from a user, and then we'll add those numbers together and print the answer out onto the screen. So this will give us some practice in getting input from users, and we'll also talk about getting numbers from users as opposed to just strings. So I'm really excited to get started on this calculator. The first thing we want to do is create two variables, and inside of those variables we want to store the two numbers that the user wants to add together. So down here I'm just going to say num1, and that's what we'll call our first variable, is equal to, and now I need to get input from the user. So I'm going to say input, and inside these parentheses I'm going to say enter a number. And now I basically want to do the same exact thing, but for the second number. So we'll paste this guy down here, and I'm just going to say num2, and then we'll just say enter another number. So now we're able to store the user's input inside of these two variables. So now all I want to do is just print out the result. So I'm actually going to create a variable called result. So I'm just going to say result is equal to, and basically we just want to add these two numbers together. So I'm going to say num1 plus num2. And now all we have to do is just print out the result. So I'm just going to print result. So we basically have our entire program written out here, and this will allow us to enter in two numbers, and then we'll add them together and print out the answer. So I'm going to click play, and down here we can enter our number. So I'm going to enter the first number, we'll say 5, and I'm going to enter my second number, so let's say 8.0, or let's say 8.3. So now it should print out the answer. But if you look over here, that's not quite the answer we were looking for, right? 5 plus 8.3 is definitely not 58.3. And here's what happened. When we get input from a user, by default, Python is just going to convert it into a string. So it doesn't matter what we put down there when we're entering the numbers. Python's always just going to be like, okay, this is a string, that's it. Sounds good, right? It's just going to make it a string. In order for us to make these num1 and num2 variables numbers, we're actually going to have to convert the strings that we get from the user into numbers. And so the way that we can do that is by basically just coming over here, and when we add the two numbers together, I can use use a special Python function in order to convert those strings into numbers. And there's actually two Python functions that we could use for this. The first is called int. So I could say int, I can make an open parentheses and I can make a close parentheses. And basically what this is going to do is it's going to convert whatever is inside of these open and closed parentheses into an integer number. And an integer number is basically a whole number. So it's like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So it's a whole number. In other words, it can't have a decimal point. And so what I could do is I could say int, and I could put these inside of parentheses. And now what this is going to do is it's going to convert both of these numbers into integers. In other words, into whole numbers that don't have decimals. And it's going to add them together and we'll print out the result. So why don't we do that and we'll just see if this works. So I'm going to click the play button, and down here we'll enter our first number. So I'm just going to enter in a 4, and then I'll enter in a 5. And now you can see it's printing out the correct answer, 4 plus 5. Whole numbers that don't have decimals, and it's going to add them together and we'll print out the result. So why don't we do that and we'll just see if this works. So I'm going to click the play button, and down here we'll enter our first number. So I'm just going to enter in a 4, and then I'll enter in a 5. And now you can see it's printing out the correct answer, 4 plus 5. And so that's essentially our basic calculator. But we do have one problem with this calculator. So I'm going to run it again and I'll show you guys what that problem is. If I wanted to add in a decimal number, so we'll add 4.3 and 5.5, you'll see that we're getting this error. And that's because I'm using this int function up here. And this int function is looking for a whole number. So if I put decimal numbers inside of there, it's going to break the program. There's another function we can use. Instead of an int, we can say float. And a float is basically just a number that has decimals. So it's a decimal number. And so I can convert both of these guys into floats. And now I'll be able to use decimal numbers. So I can click play and I can just enter in some numbers. So I could say like 4, and I could also say like 5.5. And now it's going to be able to add both of those numbers even if one of them is a decimal. And that's the beauty of using that little float function. So in certain circumstances, you might want the user to only be able to enter in an integer, so a whole number. But in a lot of cases, like in this calculator, we want them to be able to enter any number that they want. So we're going to use this float function. So I'm just going to recap what we did one more time. We created two variables, num1 and num2. And we basically stored the two numbers that the users inputted into those variables. And then we converted them into numbers and we added them together and we printed out the results. So this is a pretty cool calculator. I'm happy with it. Hopefully you guys learned something. And as we go forward in this Python course, you're going to learn all sorts of ways that we can make this calculator more complex. In this tutorial, I want to show you guys how to build a Mad Libs game in Python. So a Mad Libs game is basically just a game where you can enter in a bunch of random words, so like, verbs, nouns, names, colors, and you basically take all of those words and put them into a story randomly. So over here, my web browser, I just have an example of a Mad Libs. So, down here, we're basically just taking random words like an adjective or a noun or a plural noun and entering them inside of a story. So like you read through the story and then like some random word pops up. And Mad Libs can be pretty fun. And I'm sure you guys have, at least heard of Mad Libs before. But if not, that was just a little introduction. So I want to create a Mad Libs in Python, and this is going to be really cool. So down here, I have this create a Mad Libs in Python, and this is going to be not entering them inside of a story. So like you read through the story and then like some random word pops up. And Mad Libs can be pretty fun, and I'm sure you guys have, at least heard of Mad Libs before. But if not, that was just a little introduction. So I want to create a Mad Libs in Python, and this is going to